Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Database. We have MJ with us today, and we're going to be exploring a very exciting topic. In fact, for the next few episodes, MJ and I were kind of planning to focus on Microsoft Fabric. There's going to be a lot of very exciting stuff coming out of it. Today, specifically, there's one area that we'll be exploring, which is the evolution of Microsoft Database and data warehouse in the past, I don't know, 30, 40 years, and how we get to where we are today in the Azure space, but more importantly, how does Fabric kind of change the current landscape as well? So I'm very excited to find out a bit more about that. So I'll hand it over to you, MJ.
All right, thanks very much, David. Okay, so hi everyone, MJ here again, and we're gonna talk about the history or like the evolution of data warehousing, in particular within the Microsoft lens, right? To start with, I've actually created a post last year, when Fabric was kind of like very new and like just gives me a really good understanding on the evolution of this technology and where it came from, like what are the different challenges that happen along the way, right? Back in the days data are mostly on premises, meaning companies are actually hosting, they have their own data centers, they have the physical infrastructure to actually, set up server racks, do all of those networking, do those cooling, installing server OS and all those things, right? So that was a thing in the past, right? And maybe it still is today. But the idea there is that you have a bunch of servers and server racks that are installed with different things, right? So the important aspect back then was that you have a database server, right? Again, in a server you install SQL, MS SQL Server, right? And then the thing there is that this is kind of like think of it like this is your transactional database back then, right? So when there's an application and talks to a database, all the data is stored in here, like transactionally, um, in that capability. So we call this, if you remember the term, David, like we do this thing like this like OLTP, right? And then the thing is, things like Oracle and other databases are also OLTP based database, right? That can accept records. Now, um, the thing is, when you have data in a database server and you want to generate reports, you don't. And when we talk about reports, it's like really big set of data to work around with. You don't necessarily have to perform a SQL statement to get all, query to retrieve all the information, right? So that's like not the right way to do it because if you do it that way, it's gonna affect your database server, right? And then it might cause
Yeah.
the application to crash or like it's hanging because you're trying to perform a very very expensive and hard query to do, right? So that's
Mhm.
why the way Microsoft addressed that is the concept of SSIS. So it's SQL Server Integrated Integration Services. And from there, right, like what happens is that SSIS becomes like the linker between these transactional databases into the data warehouse server. All right. So in this case, you have a separate SQL server here that's only meant to perform data warehousing, meaning it's meant for reporting, right?
Recording.
So your application doesn't talk to this guy, right? This is again just for reporting purposes, right? And from there, this holds all the data, right? It is like again warehouse. If you look at the physical warehousing, like this is where you put all of those items, right? And then using SSAS, this is what you actually use to analyze this data, right? So back in the days, um, there's no DAX queries, there's no things like that. The way to do it, there's no Power Query and all those type of capabilities. So you use SSAS to analyze this, right? Let's say you want to do joins, you want to create your dimensions, your facts, like you kind of like want to perform them using SSAS, right?
Yep.
And then back in the days, there's no Power BI. You have Crystal reports with
Mhm.
SSRS, so SQL Server Reporting Services, right? So this is what you have back then, and this is kind of like what generates the reports and something you can print in a printer, right? So this is
Yep.
the old data warehouse, setup back then, David, right?
Yep.
And yes, you have Active Directory to make sure everything's kind of like federated, like they're all connected securely, and also access to file servers in case you have some
Mhm.
Excel sheets back then that you want to integrate with your data warehouse. That's already a capability even back in the 80s, man. Like yeah, without all this new fuzz happening
Mhm.
lately, which is around 2009 to 2015, probably 2014, right? Something like
Mhm.
that.
Okay.
Um, this is the lift and shift era, right, David,
Mm.
right? Like this when everyone's like, hey, on-prem server, move to SQL Server on Azure or move to a different cloud, so on and so forth, right? You lift and shift, right? It's like everyone's moving their um, workloads into a virtual machine or
You want to
some.
zoom in a bit.
Oh,
So
yes,
yep,
yes, there you
that's
go.
better. Yep.
So this like when that lift and shift era, wherein like, okay, now you introduce SQL Server VMs on Azure, and some have also migrated to a more native cloud flavor, which is the Azure SQL offering, right? So this is that era when it's not just on-prem database servers anymore. So now you have cloud, right? So that changed a bit as well in terms of like how you perform data warehousing. Um, but this is the time when orchestration as a term becomes much more used in the data landscape rather than just in application. Because meaning we now have this concept of like pipelines. And like back then, it's more like a task, right? Like it's this time around, we came up with concept of pipelines wherein like a technology like Data Factory allows you to, by the way, Data Factory is technically just like SSIS, but like on cloud when it began, right? Um, but then it kind of like matured faster and faster and still very useful up until today. Right? So Data Factory is kind of like the evolution of SSIS, right? To integrate all this data, right? So that means that if you wanted to connect to an on-prem server or a virtual machine SQL Server or an Azure SQL, use Data Factory. And then you can now either use Data Factory as well to ingest data from blob storage. So instead of the file server that we mentioned up there. And then
Yep.
the endpoint is that you're now hosting all of this tabular data in a SQL data warehouse on Azure, right? So like you now have a separate service that's dedicated mainly for warehousing capabilities, right? And this is a time when it became very like like out of this world because this is a time when you can really scale your warehousing faster and much more efficiently, right? Like this is the time when we start talking about terabytes of data, right? When I say starting to talk about, most of the data back then are just gigabytes, right? And then this is the time when we start talking about, hey, can we do terabytes of data, right? And then Azure SQL Data Warehouse just kind of like enables that capability and like scale it in a platform as a service manner, right? Instead of like, hey, we need more data, so we need to install more servers and create more racks and stuff like that. Um, and of course, David, this is the time when Power BI was introduced. So Power BI, the most loved data software of Microsoft, it was introduced as a visualization tool. And the way to kind of like connect the data warehouse to Power BI back then is with the concept of an AAS, analysis services, which again is the lift and shift version of the SSAS, the SQL Server Analysis Services. So it's technically that, but just move on to the cloud. And instead of using the local or like an on-prem Active Directory, you're now using Azure Active Directory. So if you look at it in this landscape, it's literally just a lift and shift version of what a traditional data warehouse setup is. And let's move on. All right. So, but thing is, this is already good. Like when this was introduced back then, like it's already very powerful. But what happened since then is that during this probably 2017 onwards, right, or 2016, this is the advent of big data, right?
Mm.
And that's like the most this like feature or like the advent that happened during this time around 2015, 16, 17, right? That's like big data. Like everyone's talking about big data, like how big is your data and things like that. Um, and also the thing is when this during this advent, this is also the time when NoSQL was kind of like getting very popular, right? Not just
Yep.
that, a lot of like source data being like JSON files, CSVs, Parquet, images, audio files, and a lot of variety of data. So it's not just about SQL anymore. It's now about NoSQL, about unstructured data, semi-structured data. That's when the change that happened. And like with this, there's also like IoT sensors sending data very frequently, and so on and so forth. That's why the architecture has to change because of that one. So the major changes that happened was that first off is that Azure Data Lake Storage was introduced. So it's not just a blob storage anymore. Like when you say data lake storage, like it can literally store petabytes of data, like any storage, right? Like it's not a question more. It's not a question anymore of like, hey, can this platform store my data? The answer is yes, but the question now is, what data am I storing in there, and can I afford it? That's more like the question. And then the concept of data factory was still in there, but then there was an attempt to create this unified tool called Azure Synapse Analytics to kind of like, hey, you can use this data factory capability, but we also have Synapse pipelines, which is kind of like to like with data factory with connectors and so on and so forth. But within Synapse, there's also like notebooks capability. There's also Spark. You have that, if you want to ingest data, you want to put machine learning or Python and stuff like that. That's when it started kind of like diversifying, right? It's not just about SQL anymore. And also this the advent when Databricks became very popular or starting to become popular. Um, and kind of like the official method back then was that Databricks can be your tool for ingesting and preparing, and you're using Synapse as kind of like your warehousing capability, right? And Power BI just became much more popular since then. um, but the key architecture that changed again is data lake, um, the support for a bunch of different data sources. Databricks became very kind of like loved and popular as well, and yeah, like an attempt to create a unified experience. So
Okay,
that's kind of
yeah,
like what changed.
interesting. Yeah, I guess this is also when storage and compute, like the costs really start to drop.
Mm,
And
yes.
yeah, so it became like from a business perspective, in especially nowadays, the on-prem days, the business have to be very selective about what data they store.
Mm-hmm.
And then like with the two slides that you've showed just now, I think during that time, like storage is so cheap, and the concept start to evolve into let's just try to store everything
Mm-hmm.
somewhere, and later on we just need to find a way to to query those data properly. So I do have a question about Databricks. I'm actually still a little bit confused about the actual role of Databricks
Yep.
in this whole thing, because even without Databricks, I think I still have
Yes.
everything that I need. Like, so what does Databricks actually, what role
Okay.
does it play?
All right. So good question, right? And I think because where we are right now, in 2024, Databricks can also do everything, right?
Yeah.
Um, but Databricks actually started to solve the problem of, hey, I got a bunch of different sources, and I need a way to kind of like crunch that, do transformations and like clean them, like, hey, I want to remove all the duplicates. Hey, I want to format this street name with with Python to make it look like this, like, and all those kind of like transformations, cleansing validation that I want to do, right? That's what Databricks started to do, right? That's why it was very powerful, because Databricks also uses Spark, which historically was based from Hadoop. So like it has that capability of loading a lot of data on a data frame, and use Python or Scala or R to kind of like transform that data in like at scale, right, and really fast. Um, Compared to back then in SQL world, you have to force everything to be in SQL tables to do your transformations, right?
Mm.
But in this regard, like Databricks started onto that, like any data you just use Python, create notebooks, and like you can transform them into tables that you can use for reporting purposes. When we move to Fabric, right? And again, this is very important connotation, right? So if you think of it this way, what Fabric is really trying to solve is that, um, comparing this to this one, I have so many tools and I need to use Synapse, and I have to jump to a data lake storage, then I have to use Power BI, and I have to create my pipelines in either Data Factory, then I have to do my transformation in Databricks, right? So it's a bit like a five set of tool set here, right? Um, the concept that Fabric is introducing here is that, why not just unify all of them into one single workspace, right? Because what worked is the concept of workspaces in Power BI. That seemed to work, right? That's why not let's use that same concept, but apply it to the concept of data warehousing, right? And again, I have an emphasis here that it's data warehousing. Um, because in Fabric, there's actually multiple storage as well. Besides the data warehouse, there's also a lake house and there's a KQL store, right? And there's coming more out there. So workspace wise, meaning I don't have to jump to different tools. I don't have to log into Azure to access the Synapse workspace. I don't have to open Power BI tab to access that workspace. I don't have to go to the different tab of Data Factory just to kind of like do my ingestion, right? Then I don't have to jump to a different tool to see all the data in the data lake storage. So that's kind of like what Fabric is initially solving, right? Like that point. Then second is that what if your data is outside of Azure? What if your data is like in an S3 bucket or something? And the thing is with Data Factory, most of the time, with all these ingestion layer capabilities, right? Pipelines, you're usually copy pasting data from source into, let's say, your data lake storage, right? So if we go back here, most of the time, hey, I have a data in Azure SQL. I put this to my data lake storage Gen 2, right? I have data in Cosmos. I put it in here. You know, that just means that you are duplicating data a lot. So what Fabric is doing on that second problem is that they've introduced this concept of one lake. So one lake allows you to create shortcuts, and you can still support that, ingestion of like from different source, but then one lake is like a unified um, storage that is not just within the workspace but within the whole tenant. So everyone within that tenant have access to one lake, right? And then some workspace have restricted access to a certain items in a one lake and so on and so forth, right? But then in terms of like one lake is think of it like just your OneDrive where you can see all your files, right? And with things like S3 bucket, you can create shortcuts in there. So you don't actually need to, like duplicate this data from S3 bucket. You can reference that directly. So let's say you want to create your data warehousing T-SQL script in here. You can reference that S3 bucket directly and like perform that. Or let's say you wanna use Cosmos DB. Now it's recently announced with the mirroring capability. So you don't have to ingest that data into one lake. You can like mirror Cosmos DB directly and perform your analytics, right? So that's what Fabric is really solving. One is a tool where I don't have to jump to different sites, different complex kind of like navigation scheme. And second is that all the data is stored centrally somewhere, but I have governance on on all of this. And obviously still with the scale of cloud, like you can scale so much and also retain what's working, which is Power BI, which is well loved, right? So that's now the full Fabric experience that it's trying to solve.
Yeah, so I actually got a question. So it's called One Lake. So
Yeah.
can a organization have multiple One Lakes,
No.
like tenant? Just
Well,
again, one
it's
tenant,
one
one lake.
tenant, one lake. Okay.
Okay. I think that's probably like a very important concept because
And if you're familiar with SharePoint, you would think of it like SharePoint, right? You have one SharePoint per tenant.
true. And then you just end up having different sites within the
Exactly. And those sites are basically workspaces in Fabric, right?
mm,
The good thing as well, David, with Fabric that I'm seeing so far, why I'm kind of like sold in this regards is that as a data engineer, data scientist, or data analyst, I don't have to go to Azure, right? I just go to Fabric. Everything I need is in there, right? I know I don't need to go through a workspace somewhere that I have to go to Azure first to log in and so on and so forth, right? So all this platforming work is kind of like abstracted away from me. So I don't need to be an expert in Azure or like know how Azure works to do my data engineering, data analysis work. I just go to Fabric, which is again a good thing, right? It's not a bad thing, even though I love Azure, right, and all the platforming capabilities too. But as a data engineer, this is good, right? Because I don't have to worry, oh, how do I set up the Spark cluster to be this, like, so on and so forth, right?
yeah, definitely. So like the experience, I guess, through, for example, Python, um, you just use Synapse and then you can connect to so many different sources in a kind of pretty much the same way, whether it's like S3 or some other tools. Like I don't need to worry about the complexity. If I've got access to that, table or system, then I can just
Mhm.
query it directly and put it into a data frame. I can kind of join um, data from different sources in that Python environment, and then do my analysis without having again to worry about, oh, I can't mix this with that because they are from
Exactly, right? And at the end of the day, if what you're after is Power BI reports, like data analysts just look at the dims and packs and like, hey, they don't really have to work through the underlining kind of like nitty-gritty of like, hey, how did we get the transcript from the audio file, or how did we get it from that JSON object or that REST API somewhere, right? They just focus on the reports, which is again the powerful thing that Fabric introduced.
So if I look at this compared to the very first one, I'm just thinking the one thing that's missing. So we've got like a Data Factory, SSIS, but where's SSAS now?
Oh, because that SSAS is now kind of like the thing is, because all of these are so powerful, right? Like SSAS is now between this Power BI and Synapse Data Warehouse, right? So within the data warehouse, you now have that again SQL pool capability to perform those expensive analytical operations, right? And Power BI, and then we can go into this in detail later on with this data warehouse and Power BI. But
Yeah.
with Power BI, you now have a lot of importing capabilities and how do you actually query this data, right? Um, yeah, and like there are
Yeah.
now a lot of advantages wherein like the do direct query or direct imports or shortcut query and all those different things that we can actually look at now.
Okay. Yeah, you did. Just high level. How does what's the costing side of things looks like for?
Okay, all right. So the novel thing about costing with Fabric, right? Like they're now going to be priced according to capacity. So they have a concept of capacity, right? So think of it like Power BI embed. So
Okay.
now it's about capacity, right? And that capacity can run all of this, right? Run Data Factory, run the data warehouse, run the lake house, and so on and so forth, and even the Power BI reports. So now
Mhm.
you're just trying to reserve that capacity. Okay.
Okay.
Um,
So like in the Power BI world, there used to be like a premium capacity, and then so Fabric is having like a similar kind
Very
of
similar, yes. And then
yeah.
it varies all the way from, I think the very first one is around $350 or something. Then it goes all the way to like a very high capacity, like $140,000 a month or something. Like, like
Yeah.
it just depends on how much workload you need.
Sure.
Yeah, we can wrap up with this one, David. Like, I think in my conclusion here, right? Like this different era try to solve different things. Like, the first one in the 90s and 80s, you're kind of like you just need or want a data infrastructure, and then on 2010s you need to scale that. Um, so from 2018, that's when you see it's not just a scaling problem anymore, but the volume and the variety of data that's coming into play. And now with 2023 onwards, now it's more around like how do I collaborate with data engineer, data scientists, data analysts, so on and so forth, plus AI, right? Like how do I make sure that I have the right set of data for AI, and I think that's just how I see it, that transition. Like these are the different problems in these different eras.
Mhm. It kind of evolves. Um, I mean the period kind of also shortens as well.
Ah,
Beginning
yes.
we're talking about like 20 years, and then within 10 years, and now within 5 years.
Yeah. Yeah. It just
Interesting.
shows you that, how fast technology is really advancing, right? Like there's actual value in Power BI devs. And it's very apparent, right? Like, businesses who are not really into tech hire analysts to kind of like represent their data into visuals, right? Hence Power BI. But what I'm seeing here is that a lot of these people who either came from the Power BI background or let's say DBA background or machine learning background or Python or Scala background, they can just kind of like become a full stack, becoming like a full stack data person, like just how we have full stack developers, like we will have like full stack data developers or something like that, right? And Fabric is one of those tools that could probably help create that kind of like end to end, unified experience, and at the same time end to end kind of like data role that enables everyone. So we need to really, get going with Fabric because this is the real deal.
Yeah. But I think this particular one is provides that kind of high level history background about, direction wise where Microsoft is heading with Fabric, why they're kind of heading towards that way as well. So it's been a very valuable sharing. Thank you very much.
Yeah, all good. All right. So
Okay.
thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you on the next episode.